This program is a paid commercial announcement from Jacob Media Partners and does not reflect the views of WPHT or its management. Today's program is pre-recorded.
Jacob Media Partners presents The Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion. Presented by the law offices of Adam Malamut and Associates. Powered by InjuredWorkers.com. And driven by Jaguar Land Rover Westchester. Now, live from the Malamut and Associate Law Studios, The Adam Malamut Show. Hosted by Adam Malamut.
And a good Saturday evening, everyone, and welcome into the Adam Malamut Show as we come to you on what is Father's Day weekend. We welcome everyone into what is part 2 of the Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion, right here on Talk Radio 1210, WPHT.
Thanks, Krause. In addition to Father's Day weekend, we're also celebrating the entire month of June as LGBT Pride Month. I want to make sure that we recognize our brothers and sisters out there. The racism and discrimination and equality affects them just as much as other sects of our population. I want to make sure that they receive the respect and the acknowledgement that they also deserve, and we join them in their fight for equality. Community can't happen without unity. We started the last segment, our first show on this topic, with a monologue from me. And sparing the monologue, I want to mention names again: George Floyd, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Walter Scott. The list goes on. America has a problem. We have a pandemic, and that pandemic is beyond coronavirus. It is a pandemic of racism. It is a pandemic of inequality. It is a pandemic of lack of respect for our neighbors, for our next-door neighbors. It's a lack of respect. I don't want to be so coy as to lump everybody into it. Law enforcement officers, we are huge supporters of law enforcement officers, and there are millions of great law enforcement officers out there. They should not be judged. Please do not judge them based on the actions of a few. But I will tell you that the bad apples, the people who have committed these crimes against people who aren't here anymore, that needs to be a signal for change. That needs to be a signal for where our country is going wrong, where our country continues to go wrong. For so many years, it was in vogue to not talk about racism. And for whatever reason, and I don't want to speculate, although I could, why presently, since 2016, it seems to have been more popular to come out and carry a Confederate flag or do things that are offensive in ways that the people who are doing it can't even imagine. We're talking about community. We're talking about systemic racism. During our last show, we started to delve into this topic. I want to come right back to that topic. Keith, let's talk about systemic racism and what we're seeing with bias in the courtroom, on TV, with our clients that we meet in our office, and what's going on.
Yeah, as we talked briefly about last week, I referenced the fact that just people buying insurance policies for their automobiles are being subject to different rates based on where they live and certain socioeconomic factors. They're paying more for less coverage because of essentially their last name, the color of their skin, and where they decided to make their homes. We're seeing issues even in terms of matters getting to litigation, matters getting to the courthouse, contested actions. It's interesting that we're supposed to have trials assessed by juries of our peers, and when you go into the courtroom, there's not a member of that jury pool that looks like you. How is that a member of your peers? So there needs to be some And again, these conversations are bringing forth more questions than answers, and I think that's healthy, because I think that goes to how far pervasive these issues are, because they're just layer upon layer. It's not a matter of figuring out one issue and then checking the box. It's a matter of, okay, we've encountered this issue, but now there's another issue, and it's just so far deep as to what we see. I don't know where the beginning is, because we certainly don't know where the end is.
And it's like any other pandemic. We don't know what we don't know, because for all these years we've had people that have lived with us, lived next door to us. We've seen shopping. We've seen at social events that we really didn't know how they necessarily felt. So I can tell you personally, it's definitely changed my circle as I look back and I reflect on people that, and for those of you who are not aware, I'm in a multiracial marriage, and my children, no matter how they may look, have a mother who's a woman of color and a father who is Caucasian. The fact that we have people in our community who may judge my kids and say, "Oh, well, I had no idea what you were." The answer would be a boy and a girl. But that's how people look at others, and that's how the systemic racism that I think Brian was talking about, that is the behind-the-scenes racism, really exists. Brian, you were a college athlete. What was that like? What did you confront from either in high school or college from a social racism point of view?
Well, there are, and you probably get the same answer for every, I can't say every, for a majority of black athletes. You're automatically, no matter what your sport is, put into a stereotype of what position or what role you should play on that team. As a basketball player, and I played at every level, even at the professional level, I've played every type of basketball there is. And no matter what team I was on, I was always immediately directed to be the slasher or the most athletic position on the court, when in actuality, I was the best shooter on the court, which is typically the role that was reserved for less athletic players. And white players were the shooters, quote unquote, the shooters on the actual basketball team. But I never had a real opportunity to play what I felt was my natural position, because I was athletic, but I was automatically put into that role because I was the kid who can run and jump. And as you speak to black athletes, you'll learn and understand that, as a black athlete, you are supposed to be good at running and jumping. So I was constantly put or placed in that box.
It's crazy. It's like that's ingrained in us from grade school up, right? It's that's what people tell you. That's what people tell, gym teachers. That's what people tell coaches. We're going to take a break in a minute. When we come back, we're going to continue on systemic racism. We're going to go over to Damon. I'd like to hear I'd like to hear his response and how he's been affected. So we're going to go into break. We'll see you in a couple minutes.
We'll get into our opening break here on the Adam Malamut Show as we come to you on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT. Don't forget you can connect with Adam on Instagram and on Twitter. You'll find him on Twitter at Adam S. Malamut ESQ, and on Instagram, attorney_Adam_Malamut. Back in a moment.
That I want change, because I talk to my mom every day, and she's like, that could have been your brother. That she keeps saying that could have been my son.
The Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion.
Welcome back. So we're going to get back into systemic racism. Bryan Turner, Damon Pennington, Keith Gentes. I appreciate all of you being here today. This is part 2 of a 2-part show, which we very well may stretch into a 22-part show. But this is part 2 of our 2-part show. Community can't happen without unity. And we're going to get into what that means in a later segment. But I want to stay on the topic that Brian was just talking about and flip it right over to Damon. Damon, give us your experience.
I have two black young men, 11 and 13. And with all this going on television, we have to have the conversations with them about, race, obviously. Brian mentioned earlier, sometimes race can be right in your face. This is racism. And both of my kids play basketball. And, again, I'm sort of segueing into this, but growing up, the quarterback has always been a white guy because he's a smarter guy. That's what we've always been told. Now we have a number of black quarterbacks. So my kids really didn't sort of get it. They live in the suburbs, and I get it. Sometimes they live in a bubble of Voorhees, and you may not necessarily see racism in front of you. So we said, hey, what if B became the starter in front of you? And they said because they thought he was a smarter player. How would you feel? And he's like, no, but I'm better. I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying if the coach said he picked him as a starter and not you because he thought he was a smarter player, how would you feel? He's like, I'll be upset because I'm just as smart as he is. And I'm like, that's a sort of an underlying sense of racism right in front of you, and you don't realize it. Sometimes we look at racism as he called you the N-word. Yes, that is racism. But sometimes if you can judge a person or pick someone or give someone a higher rate because of their color, or you say someone is smarter, or you insinuate someone is smarter because they play the same sport, I think that's just as much racism as calling someone the N-word.
So, Damon can't do it because he's the dad. And I won't mention his kids' names for privacy. I also don't want to face the wrath of his wife for putting their business out there. But not only does he have two young men, he's got two young gentlemen who undoubtedly either one of them could take him in one-on-one any day of the week. So these boys are talented. They're great basketball players, but they're greater human beings. And I'm very proud to have them in our lives. The racism that we see, to both Damon and Brian's point, extends well beyond athletics. It extends well beyond the mere mentioning of hair. Oh, your hair is so nice. It's so curly. I wish I had hair like you.
Can't touch it.
Can't touch it. Can't touch it. Don't touch the hair. We were joking during one of our breaks that either one of our wives would uppercut somebody if they touched their hair. But systemic racism goes further than that. It's discrimination. In Burlington County, former Senator Diane Allen enacted probably her greatest legislative measure was the Diane Allen Equal Pay Act. And our law firm is on the forefront of ensuring compliance with the Diane Allen Equal Pay Act. And that's not just dealing with race, that's dealing with gender, that's dealing with age. That measure is just one of many that people can avail themselves of if they're not being treated right. The problem is people are afraid to step up. People are afraid to step forward and say, I'm not getting treated fairly. I'm getting disparate treatment. How can we, Keith, encourage people to be more vocal? How can we give people the safety net of knowing that it's okay for you to come forward?
I think the simple answer in terms of making people more comfortable with speaking out is to let them know that they're not alone in speaking out. There's always strength in numbers, but if we as white individuals in the society, if it's imposed upon us that being silent is no longer acceptable, that's when there's actually going to be systemic change, I believe. When we get to the point where we're speaking out on every incident that we see, that it's no longer acceptable, that we're not just speaking out as, white people protecting African Americans. We're white people speaking out and protecting the whole of society because that's what everyone deserves, equal treatment under the law. I think that's when things start to actually gain some steam and have that, snowball effect, for lack of a better term.
That's exactly right. And, it's It's consequence. We've got to create consequence. We teach our kids, every family, it doesn't matter what color you are, what nationality. We teach our kids from a young age that bad behavior results in consequence. Right. We've got to teach society that. We've got to teach corporations that. For corporations to be able to get away with ignoring, we'll use the NFL for an example, ignoring their players whom they make billions off of, ignoring their social concerns, the NFL's failing. I don't know what's going to happen when they do come back, but I can tell you it's not going to look the same. You've got players who have made statements they wish that they didn't make, but you can't get the toothpaste of racism back in the tube. Right. Once it comes out, it's been heard, and you're not going to be able to unhear it. What kind of consequence, Damon? What can we do to teach people to change, to promote change?
Well, I think like Keith mentioned earlier, and sometimes not necessarily the victim, but in the case of white folks, sometimes you don't want to be the only one. But I think now everyone's speaking up, and I think you don't feel alone that you're speaking up for your neighbor, but you're standing beside thousands of other people that feel the same exact way you do, the same exact way, and it makes me laugh. And I think about Kaepernick, and I think about how they looked at Muhammad Ali years ago when he was against the war, and he went and gave up the title, and people vilified him. And years later, he became the hero of heroes to American citizens, worldwide, really. And it almost looks the same with Kaepernick. It almost looks like he knew what he was talking about, and I think a lot of people felt the same way. But I think the NFL did what they did, but I think now he looks, not want to say like a hero, but he knew what he was talking about.
Well, one thing that always gets lost in the Kaepernick narrative, and it serves as a platform to it's a disrespect the flag type thing. Kaepernick went out and spoke to a number of veterans beforehand, right, and they explained to Kaepernick that they found that in his form of protest, if he was to sit on the bench, that would be far more disrespectful than taking a knee. So that's why he chose that medium of protest. Right. And you never hear that.
You never do.
You never hear that because it's disrespectful to our armed service members, and he laid the groundwork. He did his homework. This wasn't just some spur off the cuff type thing.
Well, that's why I love that Malcolm Jenkins and everyone, when Drew Brees said that, and I think before when Kaepernick did it, it got lost in the noise. And I think, again, this is why everyone got it now, because when Drew Brees said it, that's what everyone was saying before. Oh, you're disrespecting the flag, even though Pat Tillman did it years ago also. But Malcolm Jenkins said, dude, this was never about the flag. And if you really believe that, you're lost just like a number of other people that were 4 years ago. And I think when they start to really voice that, and you saw literally tears about to come out these guys' eyes, and telling Drew Brees this, you realize it never was about the flag. And I think Drew Brees got it at that point.
I want to share another story of systemic racism. A very dear friend of mine, I didn't get his permission to share this story, so I don't want to use his name. I'll anonymize him for the purposes of sharing the story and illustrating our point. Was a standout, top of the game football player in college, top of the game football player in the NFL, and he was in Atlanta. He was a rookie. He was driving a very expensive car. He was making a lot of money. He was driving down the Interstate 285, which I think you have to use for just about everywhere in Atlanta. Yeah. And he was pulled over. He was handcuffed. He was put in the back of the police car for over 2 hours. He was never explained why he was pulled over. He sat there while backup was called. They brought in 2 cars for backup. He's crying. He's sweating profusely. After 2 hours, the police searched his car, found a football card with his face on it, came to him at the window, and asked him if that was him. And he said yes. And their response Why didn't you tell us? Why should he have to tell him? This is the problem. Why should he have to tell him? They pulled him over because he was an African-American young man driving a car that was probably the value of their salary. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to continue with the systemic racism. There's a lot of us. There's a lot for us to talk about. There's a lot of issues that we still need to address. We won't address them all, but we'll address some. We'll be back in a minute.
Well, I appreciate what y'all doing because, y'all just trying to make yourself heard, and you need to be, So.
Is it okay that we be here on the sidewalk for a while?
All day.
Okay, awesome.
And then I can actually talk to people instead of just getting shouted at.
From the Malamut and Associates Law Studios, this is the Adam Malamut Show.
And thank you so much for listening here on a Saturday night on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT. Great conversation here on the Adam Malamut Show. Real people, real perspectives, real opinion on Talk Radio 1210 WPHT. Connect directly with Adam on social media. You'll find him on Twitter at Adam S. Malamut, ESQ. Adam, all yours.
Tomorrow is Father's Day, and again, happy Father's Day to all the fathers out there. We wish you nothing but the best, safe, healthy Father's Day. We've lost too many of you, and I'm hoping that we can, by these 2 weeks of shows, help to affect some change and create an opportunity for people to better recognize what's going on out there, to better recognize the social injustices and the number of people that are so meaningful in so many of our lives that we're losing. To that end, Brian, you've got Father's Day tomorrow with your daughter, and I know that this is something that you discuss in your household. How's it impacting your family?
It's a very, very interesting question because my wife is a kindergarten school teacher, and she teaches in a minority school district, and the problems and issues that her children deal with, she brings home to our household, and we talk about them. And the issues that are prevalent in her school district are different from the issues that my daughter has in her school district. Just a few months ago, I have to unfortunately have the conversation with my daughter that your hair is beautiful. And that was hurtful for me to have to explain that to my 5-year-old daughter, that her hair was beautiful. Your hair is perfect the way it is. Now, when and how the conversation of hair arose with my 5-year-old, I don't know, because we don't have those conversations in our house. That was brought to me. We don't have the conversation about that. So it was obvious that she may have been told, or it may have been said to her, that she was, or her hair was, less pretty than the hair of someone else. That is my only reasoning for that conversation with my 5-year-old. But nevertheless, we did have to explain that to her, and we did have to explain the differences between little black girls and little white girls. And we have to explain to her, everyone is the same. You may look different on the outside, but on the inside, everyone is the same. So now my daughter, she has that idea in her head, and I think it's good for her to explain to her that everyone is the same, although we look different. And that's just a message that I want my 5-year-old to know and understand. But that's an unfortunate conversation that I had to have with my 5-year-old. In the midst of these protests which are happening now, she sees this. She sees the TV programs that I watch. She sees when I watch CNN. She asks me about the literature that I'm reading, and I unfortunately have to explain to her, sweetheart, 4 very bad men did a bad thing. And because of that, the world is reacting. And I have to explain to her what reacting means, and she's explaining what they did was bad and why it happened. And I have to sort of explain to her the context of race relations to a 5-year-old around these incidents. So I do it with a fine-tooth comb in a way that she understands, but also in a way where if she's asked about the situation, she can give an educated response as a 5-year-old to individuals asking about societal problems that we're having now. So as Father's Day is coming, it is easy for me to say that this is going to be an enjoyable Father's Day because of everything that's going on. It makes me appreciate being a father that much more. So I hope that's an answer to your question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And, I know that, Damon, your kids are right in that age where, God, there's so many challenges for the young kids. There's so many challenges just hormonally, boys and girls, going from one school to the other. The pandemic hasn't helped with changing the young people's social lives. But how can you give your kids, and I know that you and your wife are phenomenal parents, how can you give them the confidence that they can be and will be just as successful as anybody else, and to not listen to the noise out there that may be obstructing?
I think with anything, it's about exposure. Just even myself, growing up in Gary, Indiana, it's a bubble. And Voorhees can be a bubble also. And with all this going on, we sat around and we talked. My wife talked, and she's one of the smartest people I know. And we realized, we're like, are we doing our kids a justice by not exposing them to everything and outside of Voorhees? And interesting story, we put on the Ava DuVos show When They See Us about the Central Park 5. And again, my youngest is 11, my oldest is 13. And we watched it. It was like 10 o'clock at night on Monday or Tuesday. And I realized, again, Voorhees is a bubble. And that's not the world. That's not always the world. And I just wanted to sort of expose them to that. And as I'm watching it and as I'm talking to them, I realized, these kids are the same age as my oldest. These kids were literally taken in by police. Parents weren't there, spoke. And for me, for both of us, it was a lesson for both of our children because, again, the same thing, not the same exact thing can happen to them, but things like that can happen to them in Voorhees. But I wanted them to sort of know that everything isn't as nice as it is in Voorhees, because at some point they're going to grow up and they're going to go to college or they're going to go hang out in Philly, and they need to know that the world isn't just Voorhees. And I think if we didn't explain those things to them, we'll be horrible parents. We'll be horrible parents.
Well, it's a good thing that you have those discussions, and Keith, who's got one on the way, is going to start teeing up those discussions as soon as little Keith or little Keith's daughter.
Little Keith, either way. We're figured there's very few positive surprises in life, so we're going to wait until the day of to see what we're having and whatnot. But it's interesting. As I'm sitting here listening to these conversations, particularly the conversation Bryan shared with us, with him and his daughter, I believe you said she was 5?
Yes.
I'm never going to be in a position to have that conversation with my child. That, more likely than not, they're going to be discriminated against because of what they look like or what their last name is. But I'm just sitting here thinking about the mental process your daughter must be going, just in terms of hearing the explanation as to what's happening in live events, and the dichotomy of what she's been taught between good and evil in terms of how the police are supposed to be the protectors and whatnot, and why are these people that are given this authority and respect and whatnot, why are they the ones perpetrating these issues? And my God, I think, to go back to the segment earlier, what can we do as a society? Just hearing you share these conversations and how difficult they must be needs to be pressed upon the rest of society, that God, we're fortunate we're not in that spot. And God, we need to get everyone so that they're not in that spot. So, it's heartbreaking to hear that.
Yeah, and what's the reality, Keith, is that, and Damon, you can attest to this, as black men, we are taught this from a very young age, that this is how we have to act. You hear things when you leave. When my father was alive, if I'm going out, listen, if you get pulled over by the police, keep your hands on the wheel. Don't argue. If they tell you to do something, do it. Keep your cell phone with you at all times. This you can't do. I don't want you in that area at a certain time. And the only reason is because they knew and understand that I would possibly have a situation where I would be confronted by the police. And my parents were generally afraid that something would happen to me. And that is, it was at the time, and it still is, it was a societal ill. And hopefully the conversations we're having here and the things we're doing in these communities can sort of alleviate that.
We've got an important dialogue going on here, and I don't want to minimize it and call it a conversation. I don't want to minimize it and call it a show. When we come back, we're going to continue our discussion. We're going to find a way to keep the discussion moving towards solutions. Community can't happen without unity. We'll be back in a minute.
I think we're finally getting justice. The Black Lives Matter movement has been a movement for 6 years, but it took the death of George Floyd to finally get attention.
Real people, real perspectives, real opinion. Now back to Adam Malamut.
Welcome back. We've got an important topic that we're discussing last week and continuing this week. We're discussing community can't happen without unity. We are discussing the fact that there is a systemic race issue that remains unsolved, remains unaddressed, and remains unfixed until we make significant change. We need to be the change. George Washington Carver, Percy LaVon Julian, Mae Jemison, Katherine Johnson, Marie Maynard Daly. These are important people in African American history that are not discussed as much as people like our quarterbacks, our running backs, and not to minimize the value of our sports figures. But again, ignorance is bliss, and the lack of attention to the importance of everybody in society. If these individuals were not people of color, they certainly would have gotten more acclaim for their unbelievable accomplishments and contributions to where we are today. Coming back, I want to thank Bryan Turner, Damon Pennington, and Keith Gentes for what is an amazing show, an amazing discussion, part 2 of a 2-part series that, I'm not necessarily sure we're going to stop at part 2, but when we talk about making change, it's all of you. It's the listening audience who hears these stories, who hears what we're talking about, who hears the concerns of America. This is America. We're forget race, forget nationality, forget gender. We're presently celebrating LGBTQ month. We're celebrating Father's Day tomorrow. There's no greater time to make change than now. Take what we're talking about. Let's make the change. Coming right back into it. Damon, where can we tell people to go? What's our roadmap?
As far as
change, how can we do this? How can we get the most out of our change?
I'm going to use something that you said to me the other day. Obviously, you're white and I'm black. People always say, I hate when people say one of my friends are black. And outside of work, they have no sense of reality of what that person lives. We don't hesitate in saying, hey, come hang out at the house. We're going to drink, barbecue, smoke cigars. Families can hang out. I think that's how people really get to know one another. And people say all the time, well, I don't really know what you're going through. I think when you really get to know people, and even if you read on your own, because if a person has a kid that just gets diagnosed with cancer, they learn everything they need to know about that cancer for their child. So if you really want to get to know me and what I've gone through, there's so many, it's a plethora of books and movies that you can learn about what's going on in the black race over the last 100, 400 years. So it's hard for a person to say there's an excuse, well, I don't know what you're going through. There's so many different, you can say, hey, Damon, you want to go out for a drink? It's very simple things like that to really get to know people.
Well, the excuses are racism in and of themselves.
I agree.
So when somebody has to qualify a statement with, oh, I'm not racist. I have friends that are black. My best friend's black.
Right.
Well, right there, that in and of itself is a racist statement. And part of the problem that we have is self-awareness. Look, human beings, Americans, we talk too much. We talk a lot more than we listen.
Right.
And if we really listen to what's happening, we may be more self-aware. And the change starts within. So we can't teach our kids until we change our thought processes. Brian, you've got a young daughter. Her life, and Damon and I can tell you, and certainly Krause he can, because his are much older than our children. Your life is going to continue to evolve as she gets older, and she has other social concerns in school. With her friends and who she hangs out with and how she hangs out and whatever activities, whether she decides she wants to be involved in sports or theater or arts and crafts or whatever it is, it's important for you to maintain that consistent messaging. How do you do that in light of your experiences? Because you went to a school that was, I mean, you were by far the minority in your high school.
Correct.
So how do you continue that kind of confidence for her?
I wouldn't say the easy way, but the tone that I try to live by is I try to do what's right, even when no one's watching. All the time. And sometimes it's difficult. I'm human. But that is the message that I need to portray to my daughter. And hopefully, as she grows and she watches me do what's right when no one's looking, it infuses itself into her life and how she acts in every situation. I want my daughter to see and understand that Daddy fights for people who can't fight for themselves, and Daddy fights to do what's right. And that is all that I can really do to get her to the next step, because she is going to become an adult and she's going to go out on her own. But I need to make sure that the foundation is there, that she's doing what's right. And she learns and understands what's right from me. And to piggyback a little bit on the question that you asked, Damon, you said, what do we do next? And my simple answer would be to get involved with a strong organization, no matter what it is. And it doesn't have to be a lot. Just get involved in the organization. See where you can lend a helping hand. Certain aspects of society are going to need to be changed in different areas. Like I'm an attorney. My specialization is the law. So this is where I feel that I can affect the most change. Someone else may have a different specialization. You may be a specialist at organizing. You may be a specialist at creating grants. Find your specialty and find out where you can help and try to get with an organization that has a bulleted plan to affect real change.
We can talk for hours. We can go on for story after story. My monologue in our first episode of this show is going to be available on our website, www.malamutlaw.com. It's available on radio.com. It will be available on iTunes. I don't typically get into monologues, but it's important for people to know the names of those who have, and this is just a small sample, who have lost their lives as a result of pervasive racism. pervasive, systemic racism. Thank you to our guests, again, Bryan Turner, Damon Pennington, Keith Gentes. Your contributions are so meaningful. This is how we begin the process of change. I talked about earlier, this is like the appetizer. This is how we start off. It's the actions that are going to dictate change. Folks, get out to the polls. Go out and vote. Vote for people that you have confidence in that are going to help create the change in our country. November is important, but so are your local elections. So whenever your local elections may take place, if they're not in November during the presidential, make sure you get out there and vote. On behalf of myself, our guests, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. This has been a lesson for all of us, but also a call to action for all of us. So thank you. Happy Father's Day. Until next time, I'm Adam Malamut. Have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the Adam Malamut Show, a Jacob Media production. If you're interested in learning more about the power of the radio hour, contact Joe Kraus at 267-261-3428.
This program is a paid commercial announcement and does not reflect the views of WPHT or its management. Today's program has been pre-recorded.